ASEAN is made up of 10 diverse markets, uniquely positioned at the heart of global trade routes. Home to a rapidly rising and affluent middle class with one of the fastest growing digital landscapes, manufacturing hubs and abundant natural resources. ASEAN's strong fundamentals are driving its growth and resilience. With our knowledge and insights on local markets, Standard Chartered can help you accelerate your growth and navigate the complexities of each market. As you expand across ASEAN, we can support you with end-to-end solutions, streamlining processes across multiple jurisdictions, making it more efficient for you. We are leading on the ASEAN regional connectivity to integrate trade and payments in the region. To support the growing cashless ecosystem, we've digitized our cash management. From virtual accounts to a wide range of APIs, we've optimized digitization for your transaction and reporting needs. We are investing in fintech solutions and building new business models, creating efficiencies and better experiences for your customers. When it comes to working across ASEAN's supply chains to finance your imports, exports or inventory, and raising capital for your business, our award-winning capital market solutions are customized to your needs. As you expand outside your home market, our dynamic hedging offering helps your treasury team manage volatility, ensure price consistency, and deliver competitive margins. We're committed to promoting economic and social development in our markets. Our value and philosophy are embedded across our banking products and practices. With $75 billion committed towards sustainable development goals, we can help your business make a positive impact. ASEAN's future is bright. As your trusted banking partner, we are committed to supporting your growth ambitions, co-creating innovative and winning solutions with you. We are Standard Chartered. We are here for good.
Hello and a very warm welcome to this third in the series that comprises the Standard Chartered ASEAN Business Forum. We're talking all about unlocking the region's potential. We've got a fantastic set of panelists to talk to today, and I'm going to get round to introducing them just up ahead. I'm Manisha Tank, and it gives me a great honor to do this with you today. A warm welcome to our audiences. There are thousands of you who have joined us over the last few days. And just to recap, some of the issues that we've talked about, we've heard from so many distinguished panelists about how to navigate ASEAN beyond COVID-19. Some of the topics that have come up include ASEAN multilateralism and also, of course, the regional comprehensive economic partnership. In addition to that, some green issues, as and well they should come up. Indonesia promoting hydropower, for example, and focusing on green energy. And also, we've heard about how to engage supply chains in sustainability efforts. More on that coming right up. But in today's panel, I want to introduce to you our highly esteemed guests. Let's begin, and if each of our panelists could give us a big smile and let us know that you're there. Paul Polman, who is the co-founder and chair of Imagine, former CEO of Unilever. He took a juggernaut of a company and he steered it towards sustainability. We're going to hear about that. He's also an advocate for the SDGs. Great to see you, Paul. Also joining us, we have Daniel Hanna, who is the global head of sustainability, sustainable finance at Standard Chartered. Daniel, wonderful to see you in London. Great to have you with us. Lorena Paglia, who is the worldwide sustainability chapter lead for Asia from Microsoft, will share a lot with us on how we can leverage technology to fight the sustainable fight. And also Nick Haller, senior vice president of international at Impossible Foods, a company that was born for the purposes of the food industry being more sustainable, and we can't wait to hear from you, Nick. Thank you all of our panelists. So let's get up to speed on where we stand with the green advantage, which is the title of this panel today. Of course, climate change and other environmental issues have really come to the fore. And just this week, you may have heard that Greta Thunberg has gone back to school after a week after a week, I mean a year, a gap year, where she's proved to all of us that you can take a boat and you don't have to fly. But it doesn't mean that this kind of activism has not come to the fore, and companies all over the world are embracing sustainability. In fact, Natural Capital Partners says 79% of Fortune 500 companies are on track to be carbon neutral by 2030. So what does this really mean? What does carbon neutral really mean? How do we work with carbon offsets? Do they work? Can we actually implement practically? And also, are companies doing enough to transition towards more sustainable business models? We're going to talk about all of this, as well as what COVID-19 is doing for sustainability all over the world, and whether or not it's a problem, or actually it's accelerating our movement towards sustainability. So thank you to all of our panelists for holding on during that introduction. We're going to kick off with Nick Haller. And the reason I want to kick off with you, Nick, is because Impossible Foods, as I mentioned before, is the one company represented on this panel today that was born out of the movement for sustainability in the food industry. You have come to Asia, and a survey that was produced by the OECD last year, 2019, showed that 46% of all meat consumed in the world is consumed right here in Asia. But Impossible Foods decided to go for the jugular. Asia is a core part of your business. Tell us how it's been going.
Yeah, I'm happy to tell a little more about Impossible too, and which leads us really to Asia and why we're here. So our founder, we started Impossible Foods 2011. The story started in 2009. So our founder, Dr. Patrick Brown, was a medical school professor at Stanford for 25 years. And he had always done cancer genomics research. But as a biochemist, he took a sabbatical to look at how he could have the biggest positive impact in the world with the rest of his career. Looked at energy, looked at a bunch of industries, and then looked at agriculture. And realized very quickly, by far the biggest degrader of the global environment is our use and reliance on animals for food. Animals are great at producing products that consumers love, but extremely inefficient and very unsustainable. So my background, I grew up in a beef and dairy farm, so very aware of the industry. And I look back at our farming days and my farming days, like our job as farmers is to produce good food affordably for people while maintaining our land and our resources for future generations. And that last part isn't happening. We have to fundamentally change the system. So if you look at the statistics behind it, about 45% of the global land surface is used actively for animal agriculture, more than 25% of the fresh water each year, more greenhouse gases than all transportation systems combined, water pollution, the biggest driver, species loss by far the biggest driver. And it's all just due to our hunger for meat, fish, and dairy foods. And you look at that, and as a biochemist, Pat looked at this and said, well, a beef cow is really a technology that we use converting plants into meat. Why can't we create a better process, a way that we can convert plants directly into meat without using an animal, where the cow itself is a 3% efficient technology? So for every 30 pounds of that go into a cow, we consume 1 out as meat. And it's like, it just doesn't make sense. And so we started the company in 2011, really to build products that are better. And that better means better tasting, because as a consumer in food, at the end of the day, you're going to choose with your mouth and your stomach what you enjoy. You can have a sustainability story, you can have a health story, but really it has to be a delicious experience. So we've been building a platform for the last 9 years to understand what actually makes meat, fish, and dairy food so good. And then we're creating products that are better, that can outcompete the animal. And that comes to like the type of company we are. That's our founding. We get asked a lot of whether we're a technology company or are we a food company. And at the end of the day, Dr. Brown said it best. He's like, we're a planet company. The only reason we exist as a company is to make the planet a better place and then reduce the environmental impact of the food system. And every pound of Impossible that's consumed takes 30 pounds of greenhouse gases out of the air compared to meat from a cow. So every time a consumer chooses Impossible and chooses plant-based foods, it's a real impact. So we are really mobilizing 7 billion plus people to have a direct impact on the future of our world. And that's the platform. That's why we exist. Asia, as you said, is 46% of global meat consumption, and that's our target consumer. From day one, our target consumer was not the vegetarian and vegan, it's the avid meat lover. Like I said, I came from a beef and dairy farm when we started the company. I think I ate meat pretty much every meal until I started realizing these statistics. And I was like, wow, you don't need that. I learned how to cook. I learned we have products like Impossible now that give consumers the experience you're looking for. And our job is to make it a really easy consumer choice to choose a sustainable option.
What's very noticeable, obviously, is the rapid success of Impossible Foods. And I want to go to Paul in just a moment. Before I do, though, very quickly, Nick, it's noticeable that you guys launched here in Asia B2B. You didn't go direct to consumers, and you had consumers chasing you. Was that always pre-planned, or was that something that you learned through experience that was the way to go?
Yeah, it's a good question. So it comes down to what we're trying to achieve. We have to convince the avid meat lover that plant-based meat from Impossible can perform at the experience and the target that they're looking for. And so when in the US we launched in 2016, and we could go to Whole Foods, we could put it on the shelf, but you'd probably be put in the vegan ghetto with all the other vegetarian products, which, meat consumers aren't going there to look for food. And so we said our product itself could compete head on head with meat from an animal. So they said, how can we have the biggest impact with every piece of sale? So in the US, we went to the meat chefs. So David Chang in New York City, Tracy Desjardins, Chris Cosentino in San Francisco, Michael Simon in the Midwest. And these are the meat chefs that really drive meat culture. And that just really opened up people's eyes that this is not a veggie burger. Because there's been veggie burgers, mock meats globally forever. But you're making a compromise in performance if you're a meat eater anyway, like I was. And so we knew we had to go to consumers a different way. And we saw that work in the US. So then we came to Asia. So we were in several hundred restaurants serving in the US.
Hello, Jay.
So very early. And we knew, just because of the impact and the massive scale of agriculture in Asia, that we had to move, very quickly. And we followed a similar playbook, but not exactly the same. So we look as we go to different places, and we started Hong Kong and Singapore and said, where is meat culture? And then you tie into where that meat culture is to reach those consumers, to tell that story and pull them with you. And then you expand to the masses, then you expand to retail.
Right. Okay. Well, that's a great place for me to segue to you, Paul Polman, because we're talking about culture. We're talking about the masses. This is something you know all about. You led Unilever, and that's a huge challenge. You take a company that had a huge carbon footprint, and you had to change minds. You had to move people onto a sustainable pathway. There are CEOs here in Asia who want to know, how did you do it?
Well, first of all, I enjoyed listening to Nick and his stories. The climate change, 20% of that is caused by the destruction of our natural capital, the biodiversity, and COVID is a direct result of that. And yet it's also 30% of the solution. And the bulk of it is actually the feedstock that we're producing, like soy, etc., to feed these cows that need to be replaced. So I wish him a lot of success, and I hope that companies like that grow very fast, because they're definitely part of the solution that we need. In Unilever, very simple. It is very clear that there was a false dichotomy in the world that in order to attack climate change, we had to compromise growth, or we had to incur disproportionate costs. I think we're now at the point that we have waited so long for attacking the burning issue of climate change that most companies and actually global economies are discovering that you cannot get economic growth if you don't tackle climate change. And again, once more, the COVID crisis, which has now cost us over $12 trillion, is a good example of the cost of failure. So in Unilever, when I became CEO now 12 years ago, we said in order to be a responsible company and be around for the longer term, we need to run a multi-stakeholder longer term model that puts sustainability at the core, decoupling our growth from environmental impact, increasing our overall social impact. And we put very audacious targets around that. One of them is decarbonizing our value chain. At that time, it was a little bit progressive, I would say, because there wasn't enough data. But now put yourself 12 years further, we have clear proof that companies that do that are more resilient, are actually more profitable, are better managed, better relationships in their value chains. And again, once more, during COVID, that scenario has played out pretty well. So what we did in Unilever over these 10 years that I had the pleasure to be the CEO, it resulted in a 300% shareholder return, every year growing top and bottom line ahead of our competitive set. So the data, I think, that we produced ultimately in terms of shareholder return were quite satisfying. But it is a result of what we do. It's not the reason for being. And I think that is the most important thing. We need to internalize climate change and need to know that we have an issue there that we need to attack, but also that we are part of the solution. If the CEOs that listen on this webcast are not convinced we have a problem there, I think they're out of touch with reality of the world, but they first need to convince themselves. Otherwise, the companies will not be able to move. The reality is in today's world that consumers are increasingly asking for it. Employees are asking for it. They're ready to walk out. There are many examples of that. The financial market is getting now actively involved, and I think close to a tipping point. And bar some of the major governments, unfortunately, in the world, we see most governments in the world stepping up their plans. The European Green Deal, the package that Biden is putting out, were he to be elected in November, and we see many of the countries putting conditions around these bailout packages. So companies are moving. We have now over 1,000 companies in the world that have put science-based targets out there. All obviously trying to stay below 1.5 degrees. Microsoft, a wonderful company that decided to go back to 1977 and recuperate all the carbon emissions and setting a new standard. We're also seeing more companies come in on biodiversity and setting targets to protect our natural resources. If you are a company listening in, first of all, in your region, you are disproportionately affected. The OECD has estimated in the region that about 9 to 13% of the GDP is at risk. I remember some of the discussions with the heads of states there of the Philippines or Malaysia or Singapore or Indonesia, which I still advise Jacobi there, and how far they have come to realizing not only the absolute need to tackle the issue, but actually the enormous economic opportunity. You take a country like Indonesia now, it's fully embracing its natural resources, protecting its forests, and they can soon be turned into carbon credits that actually become a source of income to further develop these countries. How do you go about it? Well, the first thing, as I mentioned before, is setting a long-term goal. That's absolutely important. And the long-term goal has to be net zero by 2050. It's by all means possible. And because of technology development at a very accelerated pace, it gets actually closer and closer within our reach. 70 to 80% of the countries in the world now have green energy that is cheaper than fossil fuel. Once you've set your targets, you need to actually back it up with shorter term targets. It doesn't mean anything to say I'm making a commitment for 2050 when we really need to halve the carbon emission between now and 2030. And stopping the economy with COVID is not the way to do it. So we have to find a way to decarbonize on the shorter term and accelerate that process. Then we need to work on transition pathways to get there. It's not easy, I understand that. It's a lot to be learned. But fortunately, we have organizations like the World Business Council, the Mission Impossible, the UN Global Compact, the ICC, which I chaired, that really have developed top material that people can use to implement this decarbonization plan. And then once you decarbonize, you have to stick to some principles, like cut your electricity use, go to renewable electricity, look at your mobility, protect biodiversity, think about circular economy, attack issues like food waste. These are often easy wins for organizations that not only reduce your emission, but actually immediately strengthen your bottom line. And that's why they are attractive. And then finally, you can't do it alone. Some of these issues are challenging. Sometimes we swim against the tide because governments have not yet woken up or they're in a too short a cycle, political cycle. So you have to go together. If you're big or small, become part of a movement that advocates, that changes on the more transformative things. My final sentence that I absolutely wanted to say probably in the beginning, this is all about people. It's not about climate change, it's about people. I think COVID again has shown that the poorest and the more disadvantaged again suffer disproportionately. We need to create jobs, we need to create better jobs, we need to create more resilient jobs, we need to create an economy that is inclusive. So this just transition is a very important part. And companies that understand that as part of ESG, the social component, are actually so much the better for it and so much more resilient to become successful in the future. The ones that don't, we probably soon have to visit them in the graveyard of dinosaurs.
I'm sure all of us couldn't agree more. On that note, when you've raised this, that it's about people, it's that social component. Let's run our first poll. Just a reminder that the results won't come for a while, so we'll get the poll up there first. Where do you believe a focus on sustainability will lead to? So hopefully this will help us understand what the thinking is at the moment. And we will look at this in a few minutes' time when we have the result. You talked there about the fact that overall you have to be quite audacious, really, in terms of your policy looking forward. And there are a lot of companies in this part of the world, in places like Africa, the Middle East, particularly here in Asia, we have lots of SMEs that make up the ecosystem. It's a very overwhelming idea. On that note, I want to take it to Daniel in London. Daniel, you're the sustainable finance global head in a bank that operates in these key territories. We're talking about Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. I'm curious to understand what your clients are telling you, because one of the ways to get companies moving to sustainability is to make sure that they're well financed to be able to do so.
Manisha, thank you, and it's great to be here on such an interesting and distinguished panel. Let me sort of answer your question in two bits, really. One is to talk about what was happening ahead of COVID, and then just to give a little bit of color around what we're seeing given the COVID crisis at the moment. So if you look at 2019, we were seeing a huge acceleration in terms of interest and also momentum in sustainable finance. From Standard Chartered's perspective, we saw a 909% increase last year in green and sustainable loans that we issued $29 billion just in the last year alone. Equally, a 690% increase in renewables and clean tech financing. So we had seen this huge acceleration coming through and some really big numbers. In fact, last year globally was the largest year ever on record for sustainable finance at 480 billion. But to be honest, it's not enough, and it was not enough. And I think you've heard from Paul and Impossible about how much we need to shift the system. And I think that's particularly true in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. I mean, we talk about clean tech and the opportunity around renewables, which we passionately believe. But across our footprint of Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, 840 million people have no access to power. Not dirty power, not clean power, they have no access to power. And in fact, if you frame it within the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, there is currently a $2.5 trillion gap, particularly in emerging and low-income countries, to achieving these SDGs by 2030. And again, I think as Paul touched on, if you think about where the most countries that are most at risk from the impacts of climate change, it is in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. And yet these are also the countries that have the biggest opportunity to leapfrog into low-carbon technologies and low-carbon pathways. And to put that into context, Standard Chartered really focuses on these markets where we think it really matters. And I can give you a comparison. If you do a solar project in Lucknow in India, it has a 7 times bigger impact on climate change than doing exactly the same project in Lyon. And that's because you're just offsetting a greater amount of carbon that's in the grid already by doing that project. So how we collectively think about mobilizing capital to move Asia, Africa, and the Middle East onto these low carbon pathways is really important. And that's why we as a bank committed to phase all our clients away from coal by 2030, but at the same time committed that we would spend $75 billion over that period in renewables and sustainable infrastructure. So I think it's a question of how we can kind of do both of those things at the same time. And COVID, I think, as we've heard, is a bit of a tipping point. On one hand, we've seen the single largest green recovery package announced by the European Union. But at the same time, it is worth noting that China has approved more coal power plants this year already than it did throughout the whole of last year. So which way are governments in Asia really going to tip? Are they going to tip towards a green build back better recovery, or is it back to kind of growth at any cost? And actually, I think that despite some of the noise, there is actually some encouraging data here. So we released a survey of high net worth individuals across Asia, Africa, and Europe. And we showed now that there is a majority of high net worth individuals who want to put 5 to 15% of their personal portfolios into sustainable finance. In fact, on our wealth platform, our SDG, so Sustainable Development Goal Aligned Credit Fund, became the #1 fund during this period. And we also have an innovative product aimed at corporate clients where they can put deposit money with us and that money gets recycled to support the SDGs. And that had its single biggest record inflow in March. So I think the momentum does appear to be there. And I think it's collectively on us to see how we can accelerate that in post-COVID.
Very briefly, how easy is it to make the relationship between the work that you're doing and then the reward? Because I know we've talked about this before, and one of the things we identified that's a challenge is information.
I think it's a great question. And actually, the survey that we did that I mentioned earlier, the two biggest obstacles I think investors talk about, one is a lack of information, and the other is a lack of standards and clarity around the impact that you're having. And I think here, the finance industry has done itself no favors. There is a plethora of different ESG sustainable finance standards. And so what we're really focused on is being able, as you say, to connect the dots very clearly. We're about to release our impact report on our sustainable finance portfolio in the next couple of weeks. And we'll show exactly the amount of CO2 emissions that have been abated as a result of this financing, the projects, the number of microfinance and vulnerable women that we've supported through that, and that impact that I kind of mentioned around geographies. It does matter where capital go. A single dollar is different in terms of affecting the change on climate change. But I think being able to do a better job at showing the direct link between the money played and where that impact is having is absolutely critical.
Yeah, and it goes back to Paul's point, doesn't it, about making sure there is that social connection that we can understand firsthand the difference it makes. Let's move to hopefully the results of our poll. So the question was, what do you believe a focus on sustainability will lead to? So those who said lower returns came in at 13%. No impact was 5.8%. I don't know, 10.1%, but that means that those who said higher returns has come in at 71%. Daniel, that's quite encouraging, isn't it?
I think that's hugely encouraging and to be honest, a little bit surprising, but a good surprise to have. I think.
Why are you surprised?
Well, I think that's because actually a lot of people associate lower return, that there is this trade-off between low returns and impact. And I think as Paul's talked about in the examples of both Unilever and Impossible show, and that's not true. And actually there's a lot of data that kind of suggests that. So, for example, a survey of emerging market countries show that companies that focus on ESG tend to have 110 basis points better improvement on return on equity, that their cost of debt actually can be up to 200 basis points cheaper than those that have poor ESG. And frankly, that's not that surprising if you think about it. A company that is well run will typically have good ESG sustainable finance metrics as well. So I'm not surprised by the outcome, but it's encouraging to hear that that's also being reflected in the survey.
Excellent. Paul, what do we do about the 13% that think lower returns and the 10.1% who still don't know?
Well, it's not what we do about the 13% that think lower returns. It's what the 13% is going to do to turn their perception of lower returns into higher returns. If they don't and consider to maintain their current business model, they are more likely going to be part of the problem instead of part of the solution. And if that is the case, I think they will have a less engaged workforce, will not be able to employ the right quality of people, and slowly over time obsolete their business model. So we understand that in every transition that is taking place, there are winners and losers, and business models need to be adapted. And there is always some that trail in that respect. So really it's a wake-up call for the 13% and to say what is really needed for myself to tip myself in the other box. The reality is that during COVID, we fully understand that the first thing you have to do is save the lives of people and actually save your own companies. 30%, up to 30% of SMEs are at risk of disappearing, and obviously getting a healthy and solid cash flow is an important part of that. So I hope that people that have entered in that 13% group are perhaps in that category, that they have these short-term burning platforms, but that they soon will move to a right direction. The evidence is overwhelming, and I think it'd be well served also for your shareholders or your owners to move there.
Well, you spoke just then about business models, and one company that has a rather audacious model when it comes to sustainability is, of course, Microsoft. Satya Nadella has announced that Microsoft should be carbon negative by 2030. That goes beyond a lot of what we've heard before. Lorena, let's bring you in here, because obviously we must talk about this. In your role, that must be an incredible challenge. How do you go about meeting a target like this?
Thanks, Manisha. Well, it is. It's definitely an audacious goal, but I think it sends a very clear, and we hear what we've talked about on our panel so far. It's all about leadership. It's about also the financial metrics, or it allows you to have competitive growth and a stronger set on returns. But it's also about how, as a leadership or as a company, how do we want to take a leading role in this space? And part of the ways that we're looking at this is around, first and foremost, our audacious goals, 2030, removing more than we emit by the time we hit 2030. When we hit 2050, it's also about making sure that we remove our full impact since the company's inception. And we're doing this across 4 different pillars. We're looking at this from a carbon point of view and extending from scope 1 all the way through to scope 3. We're also looking at this from an ecosystems point of view. So this is everything to do with our AI for Earth programs and the grants that we offer there. And in that's also things like how we're using automated intelligence and Internet of Things to be able to work with community programs and smaller startups and smaller businesses in that space, all the way through to also our waste products, or how we're looking at our waste up until 2050. And again, that's across our whole entire supply chain that's going to be impacted as we reach our 2030 goals. Now, also as part of that, what we think about from a company as a whole is, yes, we set this audacious goal, but it's also, what about our own personal accountability in this space? So we can have a strong intent and we can announce we've got these really large goals that we're aiming for, but you need to have that true accountability within your own company. And that's part of everything that we're doing in terms of how we're applying and measuring against these goals. So that's one other part of it. The other thing as well is when we look at it, it also is bigger than just us. You know, when I look at this, my personal belief and everybody at Microsoft sees it as this is really an everyone's problem. And it's about, when you go back to our mission, it's about empowering everybody on the planet, every person and every company. And a big part of this is, how do we collaborate? How do we co-innovate? How do we actually learn from each other? Encouraging and allowing that honest dialogue to take place to foster sustainability and these problem solving and solutions around this. So some of the other ways that we're doing this is we obviously have co-innovation is a big part of this. We have a co-innovation fund that's been announced as part of our carbon strategy. And that's in particular a $1 billion investment fund. We've just recently announced a $50 million announcement around that for a partnership platform around how to transform the world's energy and transportation. So that's just an example of co-innovation that we want to be able to establish with our partners, our customers, or also other innovators on how do we solve some of these challenges. And when we look at what we're trying to achieve with carbon by 2030, yes, we have some of the technology available now, but not all the technology, or some of it's in creation, but not all of it exists yet. So how do we build on these great ideas in that front? It's also how we empower customers. So how do we give customers the tools so that they can really understand and measure what their carbon imprint is, particularly around their IT infrastructure and their IT usage. And then, of course, from a business leadership point of view, it's also around how are we learning as we go through this process, and then also how are we sharing what we learn, but also equally, how are we also taking hints and tips from other people or other companies that are already leading in this space. And that's part of the coalition of leading companies that's been established just recently. That's part with Unilever, Danone, just to mention a few, also Nike. And that's all about how that particular coalition comes together to actually support heading to net zero. How do we co-innovate? How do we share our knowledge around that? So that's some of the aspects that we look at. When I think about Asia in particular and listening to all of my fellow panelists and what's been talked about today is, you know, yeah, we do have some challenges in this region. Absolutely. We're probably very vulnerable to a lot of the risks that are going to be, that come out of climate change. I mean, the science is very clear. We're looking at a approximately 2 degree increase that's been predicted by 2030. So we really need to be able to act now to impact this or to mitigate this as much as possible and adjust where we can. But then equally, within the region, we've got amazing diversity of thinking. We are an innovation hub. We are also got that demographics at scale. And a lot of that allows for the opportunity to really take a step back and really think about, okay, how are we going to solve this and how are we going to come together as a whole community to be able to take the step forward? So there's some of my key thoughts and some of the ways that we're looking at addressing this from a Microsoft point of view.
Really appreciate that. And actually, just coming out of some of the things you were saying, I want to take it to you, Paul, because Lorena there was mentioning some huge brand names. Okay. And obviously Unilever had a number of, consumer branded products under its umbrella that interact with people. You were talking about the social aspect of this on a daily basis. How important is it to get big brands behind sustainability?
Oh, it's absolutely. I think when we looked at Unilever, first of all, the most important thing as a company is that you take responsibility for your impact across the total value chain. Just like you heard the wonderful Microsoft example. Many companies still think that they can make commitments, and this is where your numbers come from in terms of carbon neutrality, by only looking at their own operations. That is not enough. In Unilever, for example, we calculated that we had 4 million tons of carbon in our own operations, but 400 million tons in our whole value chain. And 65% of that is actually happening at the consumer level. How long they shower, in warming up the water with cooking, all the other things related to that. So we have to use brands to drive awareness and consumer change. Ben & Jerry's, one of these ice creams, we actually made the whole model carbon positive. The freezers with natural refrigerants, the cars with the mobility with alternative energy, obviously, with the factories running on biomass. But more importantly, we started using the brands. One of the things we did, for example, to get the climate change agreements at the COP21 in Paris, this important agreement that we reached at that time, was to have an ice cream variant that was called Save Our World, Save Our World. And the big slogan was, if it's melted, it's ruined. And that was very successful, not only in terms of the product itself, but creating the awareness. We also need to drive that habit change. So we need to make it simple. We need to make it comparable. We need to make it fun. But ultimately, it is the consumer that has a bigger influence in their spendings, in their choices, increasingly in their advocacy, that is driving this world. At the beginning, you mentioned Greta Thunberg, but there are many Gretas now being born inside of companies as well. And these are citizens or consumers. We also see the market rapidly shifting to sustainable products. And if you're not on trend, and obviously Nick with Impossible Food is a great example of that. But if you're not on trend, you're going to miss out quite rapidly. I do want to come back to one point which is important to me, which is the say-do gap. Everybody knows, everybody understands, everybody wants to, but at the end, we're still paralyzed by our actions. And we think we're just individuals in a big system of 8 billion people nearly in this world. What difference can we make? But ultimately, it's the actions of all of us individually added up that is going to make the difference. There is a disconnect in today's polls where 71% say that they get higher returns. And that's very encouraging, by the way. That's in line with the global numbers. But then if I hear, for example, Daniel talk that the high net worth individuals only want to put 15% of their money behind it, what do they want to do? Lose on the other 85%? It should be the 85% of the money behind it and 15 perhaps on something that they might feel just good about, but doesn't have a return. So we do have a long way to go still to get consumers to make that click between what they want, what they need, and then their actual behavior. Because ultimately, these high net worth individuals, taking them as an example, are consumers of financial instruments. And they're only 15% of their money is only going to that direction, is clearly the wrong consumer behavior. So we need to change still a lot of things. And the say-do gap will be the most important thing to work on. Also for the CEOs that are listening, this is a tough game. It's tough to be a CEO nowadays, but it's also a tough game to do the right thing. It's the most important thing right now is to do the harder right than the easier wrong. And the citizens of this world will be closely watching. We've seen in COVID many companies doing good things and advertising it, but then making one mistake by laying off people or asking subsidies from governments when they didn't need it, or not paying people in their value chain, and they got caught out. And you really see their reputation now drop. You really see their businesses being affected. So that consistency is now more important than ever.
Yeah, Paul, thank you for that. And so right. Somebody said to me recently, reminded me when it came to the conversation about sustainability, that every action has an equal and opposite reaction, something we all learned in physics class, but never has it been more important to remember, right? I have so many questions. Nick, I'm going to go to you next, and Daniel after that, so be prepared, because there were a couple of things that Paul just said there that I want to pick up with both of you. Nick, we were talking about brands there. What stands out for me is something Impossible does is it uses these catchy phrases. It says, save the earth, I think, eat meat. So you have this sort of public persona as a company that's very catchy, and you've managed to win hearts and minds with that.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of pieces that go behind that. Number one, in order to say something and have it, the product has to deliver. So that's where Impossible, we spent more than 5 years developing our first product before we launched, because we have to deliver that experience to be able to make statements like that and drive consumers to change. We have seen, talking about the say, do gap. If we go back 4 years ago, people in food weren't even saying it. And you would ask, why would I buy plant-based meat? And you'd have like 15 purchase drivers. Of course, deliciousness is number one. If you go to the environmental metrics, right at the bottom. Now, 4 years later, it's number 3. It's within the top 3 in pretty much every survey you do. And so consumers are now saying they realize that impact between what we eat and our choices and the environmental impact. And now we have to deliver products that give them that experience and give a better experience. And for Impossible, when we started launching the brand, we knew we had to drive that conversation because it didn't exist. And so you do that you do have to be a bit edgy. Like Impossible is a name. It's not a standard food brand name, right? And we went to try to figure out what we were going to call our company and our products. And Impossible, once we hit that, that's us. It's like, that's what everybody thinks we're doing is. It's really catchy. People get excited by it, and it's very memorable. And then you can put things like, eat meat and save Earth. And that's how you do it, is eat meat from plants and you can save Earth. And every time you eat an Impossible burger, it's a real impact. And so we're really trying to empower consumers to drive that change, and that we're seeing consumers now change with that. And then it comes to the company, and we talk about the investment side. And it's like, if I look at companies, the only future for companies is a sustainable company. Because then a lot of that's also driven by the employees that want to work there. And we look at the applicants we get for any role that we post, and we're just bombarded with applicants because people are looking, like the young generation wants to work on causes and companies that they really care about. And you think the standard old industry is having that happen? There's no way. And so this is where the talent is going. And when the talent goes there, that drives the companies as well, and that drives that return.
Okay, speaking of returns, thank you. That's nicely teed up for me, Daniel. So let's talk about these investors and that 15% figure that Paul mentioned. Nick just then was outlining how consumers aren't going to stand for it anymore. And I think investors are becoming more and more savvy. But how can you push the agenda with sustainable finance? How can you push the envelope?
So I think it's absolutely getting your own house in order. So from Standard Chartered's perspective, we also have a commitment to being net zero and shifting looking at both our supply chain and how our operations run. But I think as Paul was sort of talking on, you've got to go a little bit step further than that, which is why we've committed to bring our lending portfolio, which is how a bank has its biggest impact on the planet, into alignment with the Paris Agreement. And so we're developing a whole series of transition pathways on an industry by industry basis so that we can help work with our big corporate institutional clients and help them transition over a period of time. And I think that's where you're going to see some of this real change. So I think that's that commitment from our side. That's partly what me and my team are set up to do, is to advise and then help finance that shift that we're going to see. I think the other big area is around innovation. And I think in particular, just thinking not just about the climate impact now, or at least not just about the land-based climate impact, but broader than that as well. Let's take oceans. The ocean absorbs 25% of all CO2 emissions and generates about 50% of global oxygen. Yet if you look at the amount of finance that's going in to protect those oceans and support sustainable transport across oceans and sustainable fishing, it's minuscule. And so we did the world's first blue bond, which is like a green bond, but actually focused at catalyzing capital to create a sustainable blue economy with the Republic of Mauritius. And I think it's that kind of innovation that the financial sector can really bring, that can then drive capital to where it's really going to make a significant difference.
Yeah, you've posted an article about that actually on the Standard Chartered website. I've read it and I encourage everyone else to do the same. We're going to just take a moment here to run our second poll, and then very soon we're also going to be getting into your Q&A. We've had lots of questions, which is wonderful. Great to see. So post-COVID-19, where should the priority of sustainability be? That's the question. Again, you're going to get some options that you can vote for, and those results will come up in a few minutes. We talked about COVID-19 before. Paul, you mentioned it. Daniel, you also mentioned it. Lorena, when you're trying to roll out these very ambitious goals, was COVID-19 a real setback? I'm asking the question because one of the things we've witnessed is the acceleration in digitalization. That, what is the figure that some people are quoting, that 5 years of work was squeezed into just a couple of months? Has that helped in this endeavor to push these SDG goals?
Well, I think when we look at it in terms of, I don't know the stats off the top of my head, to be really honest with you, but when we're looking at it from, COVID was unprecedented and was incredibly overwhelming for everyone, I think, in that's experienced it in no matter where we are, and we experience in all sorts of different ways. But the biggest thing that came out of it was the innovation and the speed of that innovation and the transformation that came out of that as a result. And when we look at what's come out of that, we've got amazing, great ideas. We've looked at the way communities have come together in really creative ways, in ways that we've never been able to do before. We're also looking at new ways of doing things. So this is, once we come out of COVID, we're going back to a new normal. And I don't think any of us really know what that's going to look like. But in terms of from a sustainability perspective, I think it's probably doing things twofold. So one thing from a Microsoft point of view, it hasn't at all slowed down what we're doing. Our goals remain the same. We've continued on with our announcements. In fact, our announcements started before COVID had really, really taken shape the way that it has. And we've continued on with our announcements going through. And I think when we're looking at the platform that we have in front of us, it's really an opportunity to continue on building that momentum and to continue on leveraging those great ideas and the innovation that's come out of as a result, and that creativity, and really being able to tap into that. And that's all part of everything I think all of us have talked about on this panel, is taking that chance to really think about what kind of legacy do I want to have, or as a business, what kind of legacy do we want to have? Set your goals, set your ambitions, and really go about how do we take that first step to co-innovate, to collaborate, and to really shape the new ideas and the new future for us in sustainability going forward.
So talking about innovation, Daniel, I want to take it back to you, because I've heard on the sidelines that Standard Chartered's major initiatives during this pandemic were turned around in literally days. Somebody woke up one morning and said, I've got a good idea about what we can do to make a positive contribution in all of this and really help clients. Maybe you could just run through those initiatives. Of course, I'm talking about that $1 billion in not-for-profit financing, which has gone a long way to helping a lot of clients and getting essential things like masks out to people who need them, making sure that hospitals can function and have personal protective equipment, for example. Just run us through the difference that's made.
Yeah, and I think, thank you, Manisha, for asking about that, because I think it's one of the proudest moments I've had in banking. As you said, someone came up with that idea at Standard Chartered, wasn't me. 3 days later, we announced it, and within 1 week, we had operationalized it. 3 months after that announcement, we have now reviewed more than $1.5 billion of individual transactions and dispersed almost half of that 1 billion commitment in terms of credit approvals. The first loan that we did was to an NGO in Uganda. The smallest loan was $500,000. The largest was 50 million. And we've done everything from fund, as you say, PPE to ventilators. But also, I think it touches on some of the amazing innovation that's come from some of the clients that we've been working with, whether that's been a steelworks that has shifted from operating in terms of industrial steel to creating oxygen tanks to be delivered to hospitals, or refitting industrial spaces to, again, deliver critical care at the time of most. I think it really does underline that where there is a real clear goal and a real focus to do that, you can actually achieve a huge amount of things in a very short period of time. And so I think that sort of talks to both the power of finance, where it's directed in the right place with a clear target, but also the innovation that it can then unlock across all these communities in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East.
I have to say, given that this is the decade of delivery, and actually a decade isn't a long time in the world of business necessarily, it's very encouraging to hear that we can turn things around very quickly. On that note of turning things around, let's get the results of the poll. And the question was, post-COVID-19, where should the priority of sustainability be? What should it be on? The options were, number one, climate, biodiversity, health and sanitation, sustainable job creation. So with the lowest number of votes, we got biodiversity. And then next up the list, climate, 26.1%, health and sanitation, 29.6%. But the winner here was 31.3% for sustainable job creation. Paul, can I get your response on the results of that poll?
This is an absolutely normal and understandable response. The two biggest issues that we have that have been identified with the COVID crisis is the issues of climate change and inequality. And both of them are actually closely linked and two sides of the same coin. And the first and most important thing that we need to do out of this COVID crisis, where the risk is that 20 to 30% of the SMEs disappear, where technology will further dislodge people in that transition, where we still have many parts of the world that are not included. If we want to avoid the issues of nationalism or populism or xenophobia that we see increasingly at the polls, we have to address the issues of inequality. So it is about job creation, it's about better jobs, it's about more resilient jobs, it's about more inclusive jobs. And that is the first and foremost priority. And I think the 31% of the people get it. But then the question is, what type of jobs? And we don't want to be in this COVID equivalent crisis every 5 or 10 years. And the financial crisis in 2007, 2008, we missed the opportunity to address the real issues that caused the underlying crisis. Only 2.5% of the spendings that the governments put in at that time went to designing a greener, more inclusive economy. The good thing now is with COVID, the spendings that are being done, about 30% of the spending is already going to these greener economies. It happens that study after study shows that if we develop the greener jobs, then actually it is also more jobs, more resilient jobs, and a better return on our investments. So it is about things like decarbonizing our electric systems. It's about things of mobility, retrofitting buildings, actually investing in biodiversity and protecting our nature is a big multiplier and job creation. For every dollar invested there, you get a $15 return for society. So, and then R&D and education, which are very important supporting elements of that. So the fact that biodiversity doesn't come out as a number one or two, I wouldn't be worried about that. What it really is, what we're talking about is how do we create these jobs? And there is enough evidence out there that this greener recovery is the best way forward. And that's why you see Biden now coming in with his Green Deal package in the US, the European Green Deal, which has a biodiversity element in it, a farm to fork element. These are going to set the standards for the world, I believe. And companies would be well served to look at that. Most importantly, for the opportunities. Wherever we look at, we're talking about trillions of dollars of opportunities for them.
Okay, speaking of opportunities, one of the questions, and we're going to get into our audience questions now. Thank you all for the many questions that have come in. And it talks about how, yes, there are opportunities when we focus on sustainability, but this question really alludes to the financial and economic cost of closing down enterprises that cannot transition. What do you do about those? It's an overwhelming problem for some.
Yes. No, totally. And part of the just transition here is that we help companies transition. I've never been a big supporter of just walking away from these companies. If you're in the energy sector, you've really helped us build this wonderful economy. So now that we have discovered that we have a problem, to all of a sudden dump them all and say they were the bad guys is not very useful. There are many of these energy companies that are trying to transition, just like other companies are trying to decarbonize. So we need to put the mechanisms in place to do that. Some of it will require government help and all. Now, in every transition, because this is the biggest transition our economy needs to go through, we need to decarbonize, we need to move to a circular or regenerative economy, need to move financial markets to the longer term, need to create a more inclusive growth model. These are big, big, big changes. And in any of these transitions, yeah, there will be winners and losers, and there will be companies disappearing and new companies being born. But what we should do in all of that is to be sure that the people that are affected, that we take care of that and work this social contract and this just transition. If COVID has shown one thing, is how it really disproportionately affects the people that were already the more vulnerable in society. So some businesses indeed will disappear, but that has always happened in the history of mankind. But I think what this is more about an opportunity and seizing it. And the SMEs, which are more agile, which are in a growing part of the world, like Asia is, where 50% of the world's R&D is in that part of the world. I think you're very well placed now to start to lead some of that and actually become a bigger global footprint and tremendous opportunities for people that understand it and that embrace that.
Yeah. Another question. Absolutely, Daniel.
Sorry, yeah, Manisha. I just wanted to add a couple of proof points to what Paul was saying there about the opportunity. Because I mean, first of all, it is the companies that exist at the moment that probably have the skill set to deliver this transition, whether it's energy companies, mining companies, or the like. But let's just talk about the actual opportunity. We did a study at the beginning of this year called Opportunity 2030. It looked at just 3 of the SDGs: power, sustainable infrastructure, and it actually quantified the private sector opportunity over that next 10 years. For India, $1.1 billion of opportunity. Indonesia, $280 billion. China, $2.8 trillion. Malaysia, $46 billion. So if you're thinking and planning out of the next 10 years, pivoting into these areas, I think is one of the ways where you can actually see a very strong, sustainable profit in the future.
Well, it's very encouraging. And on that note, Daniel, can I put to you a question that's come from our audience? And this is about the best way to, and we've talked about this previously, and I know that you're a big advocate for the role that private companies, private institutions can play here. But even in countries like India, you would have to rally government institutions to be involved and make sure that there isn't that inertia to the green advantage. So knowing that central governments have that huge impact in enabling, how do you work with them?
Look, I think, as we've talked, I think all the panelists have talked about, this is a collective goal that we are going to need to mobilize the private sector and the public sector. And actually, I think a lot of people often think that Asia is somehow a long way behind other areas in terms of focus on sustainability. But take India, which you just mentioned. The world's largest renewable private sector auction is in India. The single biggest offshore wind at the moment is in China. And if you look at what has driven the dropping cost of renewables, I think China can take a lot of the credit for that. So I think you're seeing glimmers of, not just glimmers, I think you're seeing some very encouraging signs. What we now need to do is really see that sort of pivot into the decarbonisation as well. And so I think, yes, and I think we are seeing governments, I mean, I talked to a number of the governments in the ASEAN region, and this is very much top of their agenda. But I would also say that the private sector shouldn't wait. I think there is an opportunity here to go after, and actually the regulation often will catch up afterwards. And so positioning ourselves to catch that is probably the best approach to take right now.
Yeah, and speaking of positioning, sometimes it boils down to price. That becomes a very important aspect of any type of sustainable project. The reason I'm talking about price is because I want to segue into a question about impossible meat for Nick. Nick, someone has sent us a question about the price, saying that it's slightly steep in the market. Is there any plan to bring the price down? Now, the reason I'm bringing this up, and it's a sort of a very consumer-bent question, is because this is also an issue when you have an SME in Asia, for example, that's thinking about the cost of embracing the SDGs. So Nick, talk to us about price and how important that is.
Price is huge. There's certain consumers, of course, that are going to be more inelastic and can pay higher prices. But to change systems, you can look at, so we'll take, meat. Meat is more than 750 billion pounds of meat are consumed each year. And it's a massive scale at a very low price. And for the vast majority of that, for Impossible, it's like we start with the fundamentals. So if you look at the system of a cow and how you use a cow to produce food, a cow eats plants. It's a 3% efficient technology. Then you get meat out at the end. And so in the long range, the plant-based ecosystem is much, much more affordable than a cow ever could be, just because a cow is so inefficient. Now that system has been optimized to massive scales where the plant-based industry is just starting. even at the small scale that we're at now and growing very quickly, we can be very competitive at more of the organic premium price points, and that's where we are right now. And we will continue to drop that as we scale. So earlier this year, we dropped wholesale prices by 15%, and that's as we hit scale. And we're still a pretty small fraction of anybody in the meat industry at this point. But the long-term way you change the system is you have to be highly competitive on price, definitely.
Okay.
One of the main things, Manisha, if I may say very
Paul.
quickly, Impossible Burger is actually very cheap. The problem is that we don't put in the full cost of the externalities. So that's why it's so important for countries to realize, for example, to put a price on carbon. If we really look at the cost that we are incurring for not fully recognizing the impacts that some of these products have on society, you put some products at a disadvantage versus others. So meat should actually incur a cost for destruction of biodiversity, should incur a cost for climate change. And if you are able to put these two costs on this environmental and social economics, then the economics would change quite drastically and the market would move quicker. Countries that have implemented the price on carbon tend to be more competitive now, tend to be more innovative, and actually have a more resilient and robust economy. So we do need to get to these tragedies of the commons, as people would call it, by starting to recognize them. We cannot just have an economic system that maximizes the return only on financial capital. We need to do the same on environmental and social capital. And that requires companies as well and others to internalize that into their decision making.
And also to raise awareness amongst consumers. Yes, Daniel.
Sorry, Manisha. I was just going to add another comment, because again, I agree with this, but I think this is a really good link back to the question you asked earlier. And this is an example of where I think regulation will catch up. So the EU is going to probably impose a carbon adjustment for imports coming into the EU. It's also on Biden's platform. So I think we're going to see a lot of these trading blocs now start to impose carbon pricing in the way that they think about imports. And if you just think about the scale of change needed, the IMF did a study last year that showed that on average, we price carbon at $2. To be net zero or to be Paris aligned, we need it at $75. So again, if I was a company thinking about what the next 3 or 5 years look like in a regulatory landscape, I would start building this in anyway.
Yeah, I just wonder, whether we can envisage a world in which every single good that we purchase, we will know what the carbon offset would need to be. On that note, we're running out of time, unfortunately, and I'm sure we could keep on discussing all of this. I have one last question. I wish I could ask this question of all 4 of our panelists, but Paul, this question goes to you because I think this is a really good one. And I think we learn a lot from our mistakes. The question is, what were the biggest mistakes that you've made in your sustainable journey? And even if you're talking about a mistake, I'm sure that you're going to turn it positive for us as we end this conversation.
Well, it's, I've always said if Unilever does all these things, but the world doesn't move, then we haven't achieved what we set out to achieve. And I still can't look my children in the eye. We were very aggressive. We were attacked. So lots of cynics and skeptics along the way. But ultimately, it worked for Unilever. But I think I would, first of all, be more aggressive, which we see what we find ourselves in the situation now shows that we clearly haven't moved fast enough, including Unilever. So I'd be more aggressive. And I spent more time actually getting the financial market with me earlier, having a better story, better explaining why it builds our businesses and educate the people around me. For me, it was so obvious that I moved ahead sometimes faster than being able to take an environment around you with you. And this is a challenge that we need to solve collectively. And that's why these partnerships, once more, are so important. These are partnerships, by the way, for the long-term, multi-generational. These are partnerships where we put the interest of others ahead of our own, knowing that by doing so, we're better off ourselves as well. And as a result, these are partnerships of humanity. And I think that's the area that we all need to work on. We have distilled this economy to spreadsheets, to a few numbers, to a shareholder primacy. That's catching up now. We need to put humanity back in the middle of our businesses, know why we're here, which is to make this world a better place. And if we as companies cannot show that we positively contribute to make this world a better place, I think sooner than later, the citizens of this world are going to vote you out of business. And I think that is the overall message coming out of this wonderful panel as well.
Okay, well, you talked about partnerships there, and you know, collaboration came up in this conversation. Thank you all for collaborating with me to push this agenda forwards. This is the decade of delivery, and if we have people such as yourselves working on it, then I feel very positive that we will get somewhere. So it only remains for me to thank you all. Paul Polman, the co-founder and chair of Imagine and the former CEO of Unilever, thank you so much for joining us. Daniel Hanna, the global head of sustainable finance at Standard Chartered. I said it without a glitch this time. Lorena Paglia, who is the worldwide sustainable chapter lead for Asia at Microsoft, and Nick Haller, senior vice president of international at Impossible Foods, and we are expecting those price cuts very soon. Nick, thank you all so much, and thank you, of course, to our audience. Thanks for taking part in those polls, for sending your excellent questions. We hope that you enjoyed the conversation today, that you can take some knowledge forwards with you. You feel empowered at the end of this conversation. You would have got some really good advice there and know who and where you can reach out for more. I just want to wrap up and say thank you on behalf of Standard Chartered for this ASEAN Business Forum, this series. And I want to encourage all of our viewers to register for the ASEAN country webinars that are run by Standard Chartered. You can gain insights from ministers from across the region: Singapore, Malaysia, Vietnam, Indonesia, Thailand, the Philippines. And this is all about ways that you can tap into the region's infrastructure, manufacturing, and digital economy. So if you want to register, please click on the banner that is below the media player. So you will see a link there. Just click on that link and you can get more information. We also would love for you to provide your feedback, and you can find that on the right-hand side of your screen, a link to providing feedback. Otherwise, that's it from me and from all of our panelists. Thank you so much.